Initiative Coordination Office. It serves as a platform for experts in the field of land to come together to share their values and insights and knowledge on land restoration. We're pleased to have both our in-house audience here at the UN Bonn campus and our global audience joining us for these enlightening sessions. Today's event is made possible through our partnership with the UNU EHS, the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. The focus of today's talk is to explore the economics of land restoration, shedding light on its significance, challenges, and strategies for fostering inclusive and sustainable practices within this domain. It is with great honor that I introduce our distinguished speakers for today's talk. And our first speaker is Dr. Alisher Mirzabayev, a senior agriculture economist at Unique Land Use. Dr. Alisher unfortunately couldn't join us in person today. Nevertheless, he will be delivering an inspiring presentation online. With an extensive background in academia and research, Dr. Mirzabayev has held significant roles including interim chair and senior researcher at the University of Bonn. His active involvement in numerous international projects across Africa and Asia has demonstrated his expertise at both regional and global levels. Holding a PhD in agriculture economics, Dr. Mirzabayev's portfolio includes over 100 scientific publications, which primarily focus on climate change impacts, economics of land degradation, and the water, energy, food security nexus. Thank you, Dr. Mirzabayev, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Song Kim, for this introduction. And I apologize to all participants and colleagues. I was really looking forward to be present in Bonn today, but unfortunately, the vagaries of the railway system made it impossible, which tells us about the importance of SDG 9, universal applicability of that SDG as well. But also when it shows that on the optimistic side, when it shows that when our hard infrastructures fail, our soft infrastructure, internet connections, all these IT information technologies allow us to maintain our system resilience. Of course, today I'm not talking about SDG 9. I will be talking about SDG 15. So if you can go to my slides, we could start on the economics of ecosystem restoration. Or should I share my slides from my side, or would they be shared from the other side? So this discussion today will be primarily based on the recent paper.
Dr. Mirzabayev, the presentation will be followed after the introduction of speakers.
It's not yet the start. Okay, I'm sorry for that misunderstanding then.
Thank you for introducing yourself, Dr. Mirzabayev. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our esteemed second speaker, who's sitting next to me, Dr. Ashutosh Panda, who is a prominent researcher affiliated with the UNU EHS. Dr. Panda's research primarily centers on climate disaster risk finance, agriculture, and climate change. And with a wealth of experience exceeding a decade in academia, policy, and international development organizations, Dr. Panda has undertaken extensive work in countries across the global south. And before assuming his current role in UNU EHS, Dr. Panda made significant contributions as a researcher at the London School of Economics and Political Science and the International Rice Research Institute. Dr. Panda's expertise spans various domains, including climate change impact assessment, evaluation of climate change adaptation strategies, climate finance, and climate smart agriculture. And before we proceed with the session, let me take a moment to guide you through the agenda for today's talk. Firstly, we will have the opportunity to listen to each of our speakers. Afterward, we will move into the engaging Q&A round, where we encourage you to pose your questions to the speakers. And for our online participants, please feel free to type in your questions as the presentations progress, and we will address them during the Q&A segment. Additionally, we warmly welcome our on-site audience to actively participate and ask your questions during this interactive session. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed experts to begin their presentation. And first on our list is Dr. Alisher Mirzabayev, who will explain the costs, benefits, and socioeconomic impacts of ecosystem restoration. Please welcome Dr. Mirzabayev.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation to speak during this seminar series. Today, I will be talking about economics of ecosystem restoration. And this paper, this presentation is to a large extent is based on the recent paper that we published together with a colleague, David Wupa from University of Bonn on economics of ecosystem restoration. So let me start by saying that, and I think there is really no need for me to emphasize on the importance of healthy ecosystems, which are the foundation of life on Earth, and actually our life without ecosystem services and goods that they provide is pretty much impossible. What is also important that we share these ecosystems with billions of other life forms, and it's not only human utilitarian concerns that would motivate our activities, but also this understanding that these ecosystems are also habitats for these other billions of different life forms. But unfortunately, we are currently destroying very rapidly these ecosystems. So in the next slide, we can see that extent of destruction. Here we see that the extent of areas in red which experienced human caused degradation, and also those areas, of course, were in green, which show areas of land improvement. On average, land degradation is happening at a rate 10 times faster than land improvement. This research showed that about 25%, 1/4 of land area across the world has experienced some form of degradation during this 30-year period from 1980 to 2010. And it has some economic costs, which we can see in the next slide. There are big ranges of estimates about the annual economic costs of land degradation. So including the losses of all ecosystem services that we experience. And the estimates put it from $300 billion per year to $6 trillion per year for the annual cost of land degradation. These maps that we see here show the historical cumulative losses of only carbon in terms of carbon above ground and below ground. And these losses, so when we are comparing what could be the natural state and what is now, then these losses amount to cumulatively to $20 trillion. So if we can go to the next slide, we can see that ecosystem restoration is gaining a lot of attention now internationally, globally, in many regions across the world. We have UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. Land degradation neutrality has already almost 500,000 hectares of pledges of quantified commitments by countries to restore by 2030. And similarly, under the Bonn Challenge, there are some specific regional programs like Great Green Wall and others. So ecosystem restoration is an intentional activity that initiates or accelerates the recovery of an ecosystem with respect to its health, integrity, and sustainability. Of course, restoration can be active when we do something about it, or passive when we just don't destroy, do enclosures, or allow the nature to recover itself. I think what is important to highlight is that the difference between restoration and conservation. Restoration is 10 times more expensive than conservation. That highlights this LDN hierarchy of trying to avoid land degradation in the first place. And when I say 10 times, I mean specific numbers. For example, in Africa, to restore 1 hectare of degraded land, on average, it costs $2,000. To maintain restored areas, to maintain ecosystems in good shape, 1 hectare costs on average, $200. So you can see this big difference between restoration and conservation. So we can go to the next slides where we can see this differentiation between costs and benefits of land restoration. Of course, those direct benefits from land restoration include the recovery of ecosystem services, so-called provisioning services, such as food, fodder, medicinal resources, other things, timber, for example. So those things that we can sell in the markets. But also there are many other ecosystem services regulating, supporting cultural services. Carbon sequestration is one of the important services that is gaining a lot of attention nowadays. But also there are many others like moderation of extreme weather events, prevention of soil erosion, water purification, nutrient cycling, so a whole range of ecosystem services. And nowadays we can put a monetary tag, price tag to these values. There are so many different methods how to do that, from willingness to pay studies, contingent valuations, travel costs, and many others. And also increasingly we have data sources which provide in some very global level the information about these ecosystem values. For example, here I would like to mention ESVD database. So this is the successor of the TEEB database. Before we used to have the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity database. Now ESVD, ecosystem services valuation database, it contains almost, if I'm not wrong, 9,000 data points nowadays. So it's freely accessible. So, and this is on the benefit side. On the cost side for land restoration, so when we try to actively restore degraded lands, we also have different types of costs. Acquisition costs are important in context where there is private property for land, but in many developing countries, since there is no private, there are land tenure issues. Land tenure security, different forms of land tenure acquisition costs are not often highlighted in the literature, but they are, it's important to have them in mind. Important part of land restoration costs is, of course, establishment. So re-establishing the ecosystem, lost ecosystem, and maintenance costs. So maintaining that restored ecosystem after restoration for some time so that it doesn't get degraded again. And then, of course, opportunity costs. So when we are doing reforestation and instead of a cropland, we now have a forest. Cropland was providing some sort of ecosystem services in terms of food production. So if it became reforested again, then we are losing that cropland food production services to some extent. So that needs to be taken into account in our estimations. And what is important is also transaction cost, which is rarely highlighted when we are analyzing land restoration or land restoration project. But this is very important because what are those transaction costs? So these are administration costs, research and development costs, monitoring and evaluation costs, so information dissemination costs. So all these different activities which make possible all these carrying out of establishment and maintenance activities. On average, if you look at the literature, they represent about from 30 to 50% of all land restoration costs, but they remain a hidden part of this costs so far. We don't have a lot of information about that. Increasingly, we have some studies covering that as well. Major source for the information on costs of land restoration is Econ-WOCAT database. So this is a subset of a world overview of conservation technologies database at the University of Bern. So it includes about 500 to 600 technologies which were collected together for specifically because they had consistent economic data for them. This is also freely available. One can download it and use it anytime. So in the next slide, we also see that besides this cost, we also have indirect impacts of ecosystem restoration in terms of improved food security, reduced poverty, job creation, social and gender equality, and other dimensions of sustainable development. There is a lot of literature looking at the impacts of land degradation or at the impacts of adopting specific one or two SLM technologies in specific contexts. But I think since many of these big restoration campaigns are now taking up their speed, we also probably need to have a lot more information about their socio-economic impacts in a rigorous way. They also need to be taken into account. So if we, in the next slide, we can see the benefits from ecosystem restoration. So this makes a very strong economic sense. Here we see by region that every dollar invested into land restoration brings back from at least $2 to $9 of return over a 30-year period. So all across the world, we can see that in most cases, restoring degraded ecosystems makes economic sense, but of course, it takes some time, which we can also see in the next slide. So this slide shows the importance of looking at these synergies between different activities, different restoration campaigns for facilitating improved accelerating action on land restoration. Here I gave the example, I'm giving the example of Rwanda, where we see the overlaps between the three Rio conventions, between UNCCD, Biodiversity Convention, and Climate Change Convention. So land is a central element of all the three conventions. And here, if you look at the specific targets of each of the convention, we can see that there are significant overlaps. Of course, in this heat map on the left, we see that each convention focuses slightly more on some aspects, like Biodiversity Convention focusing more on conservation, understandably, and UNCCD focusing more on SLM, and Climate Change Convention and NDCs focusing more on restoration for carbon sequestration. But we can clearly see there are some overlaps. In the next slide, here's the reasons why, despite all these benefits, here are the reasons why, despite all these benefits, why land degradation is continuing. If it makes so much economic sense, if so many organizations are working on it, and there are so many overlaps and synergies, why we still have so much land degradation, 10 times more land degradation in the world than land restoration? First reason is, of course, big part of gains from land restoration are social and not private. So we cannot, individual land users do not benefit from those land restoration effects. For example, when we are restoring a forest, individual land users can benefit from non-timber forest products or some food products they collect in that forest. But big part of ecosystem services provided by the forest is in form of these social benefits like carbon sequestration, water purification, moderation of extreme weather effects. So these are the benefits which are benefiting all society, but individual actors may not necessarily benefit from that. So this is one reason why land degradation is continuing. And with the increasing inclusion of carbon sequestration into carbon markets, carbon trading, I think we will have more positive movement in this direction in terms of incentivizing land restoration more. And also another reason is that benefits take time to accumulate. When we plant a tree, it doesn't mean that we restore that land. We just started restoration. We would have restored that land if that tree survives to the age of 30, 40, 50 years. This takes time. Unfortunately, in many regions across the world, land users, smallholder farmers, they cannot wait for so long in order to start getting the benefits from land restoration. That's why it's very important to have public action and also facilitate these restoration activities. In addition to that, even when there is willingness to restore land, there is There are many other barriers and incentives, like lack of land tenure security, lack of access to markets, lack of access to credit, and many others. So we can go now to the next slide, which shows the separation between these private benefits and social benefits. And it clearly demonstrates that on average globally, only about a half, so slightly less than a half of benefits from land restoration can be captured by private land users. But bigger part, more than half, are social benefits and in fact global benefits. So now let's go to the next slide. In the paper I talked about, we also looked at the at some major policies for land restoration and sustainable land management, such as removal of environmental harmful policies, payments for ecosystem services, expanding protected areas, restoration campaigns, and also tried to see what is the evidence on these different policy directions. So next slide shows evidence on removal of environmental harmful policies, which make up now about $4 to $6 trillion globally per year. So this is a huge amount of environmentally harmful subsidies. But one thing that we need to take into account is that this amount, $4 to $6 trillion, is the harm that the value of harm that we incur because of these subsidies. But the amount of actual subsidies is often smaller. For example, in agriculture, it was estimated to range between about $100 billion per year to about $500 billion. But although actual payouts of these subsidies is small, as you can see from these numbers, the damage they generate in terms of environmental harm is 10 times more than their actual value. So it's important to make sure that we are not encouraging ecosystem destruction through this kind of harmful subsidies. It doesn't make any sense, on one hand, to invest in land restoration, and on the other hand, to continue providing this kind of environmentally harmful subsidies. In the next slide, we can see another policy approach, which is payments for ecosystem services. This is also becoming a popular policy tool for conservation and restoration. And what is good about it, it tries to go beyond carbon, also considering ecosystem values, which many different types of ecosystem service values. Two key concerns which are still present in many projects that are being implemented is additionality, of course. So whether or not positive effects are in addition to what would have happened even without payments, yeah? And permanence, how long do the achieved outcomes persist, especially when the payments cease? So there are both successful and less successful examples from around the world. For example, according to one study, China's Grain for Green program, which is probably the biggest payments for ecosystem services program in the world, helped improve forest cover in China by 0.5%. In Costa Rica, there were big programs on payments of ecosystem services, according to another study, which looked at Costa Rican example. There were no additional impacts from past schemes. So we can see that, and we can continue this list of both successful and less successful examples from around the world. So evidence is mixed. While there are many successful examples, there are also many examples of failures. And the main reason for that in the literature, as literature shows, is poor implementation and inadequate targeting. In the next slide, we can see that the evidence is also mixed about expanding protected areas. For example, in the same area in Costa Rica, if we stay with the same example, we can see that network of protected areas, which started already from 1960s, increased the country's forest cover by 10%, compared to what would have happened without that protected area policies. So this is a significant impact. But at the same time, more global analysis looking at almost more than 12,000 protected areas from 152 countries showed that on average, protected areas did not have much ecological effect in terms of ecosystems, ecosystem functions, diversity, and in a more integrated way. But okay, they have shown some good performance in terms of protecting forests. In Brazil, for example, when protected areas were found to be more effective when they were established in high-pressure regions near cities and roads, rather than when they were established in remote, low-pressure regions. So there are a diversity of experience across the world from which countries thinking about implementing these policies can learn from. So in the next slide, we can see an example of a restoration campaign, the Great Green Wall in the Sahel region, which is probably the biggest land restoration, biggest single biggest land restoration initiative in human history. So 100 million hectares are planned to be restored. For a reference, this is 3 times the area of Germany. And our estimations show that it makes economic sense. It makes economic sense even under the baseline scenario. So every dollar invested gives back 20 additional cents of net returns. But of course, if you look at different scenarios, this varies. Here on the map, you can see especially granular representation of these costs and benefits from land restoration activities under the Great Green Wall initiative. You can see that in some places, the costs are higher than benefits. In some places, benefits are higher. So that requires a lot of targeting of these restoration activities. So this also links up to our other conclusions from payments for ecosystem services or protected areas. It is important to have proper targeting of these areas where we can maximize both environmental and economic benefits. So if you can go to the next slide, where we can see actually my last point, conclusion. So earlier this year in April, G20 Land Restoration Initiative, together with Azim Premji University in Bangalore in India, organized a conference which brought together a community of researchers, practitioners, policymakers to look into different aspects of success of solutions for ecosystem restoration. So these are the 9 elements that came out as entry points for successful land restoration in the working group that I was participating in on the social context for land restoration. We've seen throughout the examples I gave the importance of social context. The same factors may be working to facilitate land restoration in one context, but then we're not working that well in some other contexts. So that's why it's important to apply system-based perspective, considering the variety of different factors that may affect and their interaction that may affect land restoration. Targeting and prioritizing restoration needs is very important, but also monitoring and learning from longer-term land restoration impacts. Now there are some efforts being done in terms of monitoring land restoration, for example, under the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. But also I think it is important to have some kind of monitoring mechanism for the implementation of land-based activities of the 3 Rio Conventions, which would be very specific to these conventions and then help them to evaluate their progress. It's important to account for social distributional effects, so impacts on the poorest, impacts on women, impacts on other marginalized communities, and make sure that land restoration is gender responsive. Quite often in some of these restoration activities, we often think of gender as a means, as an instrument to achieve some other objectives. But we need to understand that gender empowering women is a goal in itself, objective in itself. So that's why it's important to look at this from that perspective as well, with that kind of paradigm. Harnessing sectoral and special spillover effects, a lot of linkages to energy sector, to health, to agriculture, to many different dimensions. So land restoration is a central piece of SDGs. So that's why it's important to look at these spillover effects. Providing land tenure security, we know very well, integrating restoration objectives in land use planning, and also strengthening evidence-based research, education. And I'm very glad that G20 Land Restoration Initiative is carrying out a lot of these awareness raising, but also educational initiative to promote importance of land restoration. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Mirzabayev, for sharing your valuable suggestions for achieving successful land restoration, especially your emphasis on the strong economic rationale behind land restoration, coupled with its far-reaching socio-economic benefits, make this endeavor even more compelling. Online participants, please feel free to type in your questions for Dr. Mirzabayev. Now, I would like to move on and invite our second speaker, Dr. Ashutosh Panda from UNU EHS. Dr. Panda's presentation will focus on making land restoration more enticing through effective implementation of financial inclusion and social protection strategies. Dr. Panda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, so. Thank you for having us here, and good afternoon, everyone. So I think Dr. Ali sir really covered a lot of things in the earlier presentation, and now we know that how and why land degradation is really a very serious issue at this point of time. But what's happening at the global level, we also need to think what's happening at the local level, because land restoration at the end of the day depends on the people who are on the ground, who are depending on the forests, who are depending on the land for their livelihood and sustenance. So I think we also need to look at the local level. And in this presentation, I am going to talk about the project we are working, and we are trying to see how to make the whole process of land restoration attractive in terms of the farmers, in terms of the people who are dependent on the land. So maybe we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I think many of you have already seen this diagram here, which we call the planetary boundaries. So we have already crossed many planetary boundaries in the world. And one of them is land use change, which basically means that in order to survive, we need to have 85% of the boreal forest and temperate forest need to be kept intact to survive on this world. But you can see that land use change has already crossed the red mark, which likely means that we have already crossed the danger lines. And I want to emphasize here that land degradation is not only about degrading the land, but it's also about the extent. You can see that 12 million hectares of land are lost every year to land degradation. And on the other hand, you can see that 1.3 billion people are still relying on the land for their livelihood. And the estimated cost to the world is more than somewhere 6.3 trillion a year, which is equivalent to 8.3% of global GDP in 2016. So this is the kind of challenge we are talking about. So it's not only about restoration, but it's also about the economic cost, the economic development, the number of people, those who are dependent on the land. So it really touches many facts, many facets of the people and livelihood in the world. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just to emphasize how we are really dealing with the problem of optimization, which basically means that you can see on the left-hand side the graph, there is a recent study who tried to look into the area which are potentially available around the world for restoration in different regions of the world. You can see from the graph that most of the regions really are in the low-income countries, or let's say in South Asia, Southeast Asia. You can see from the graph here. And that's where most of the lands are available for restoration, where most of the people are dependent on agriculture or they have low income. So when I say it's an optimization challenge, what does it mean? I say that land degradation is not only about restoring the degraded land, but it also about keeping the biodiversity loss intact. And it's also about minimizing the cost when you are talking about land restoration. It is also about the water scarcity. So we just no need to go there and just restore the land. We are not talking about that. If you are just replanting a tree, it's not land restoration. You also need to think about the people who are dependent on the forest. We also need to think about the loss of biodiversity when we are thinking about restoration. So it's an optimization challenge. How do we deal with this loss of biodiversity and reducing the greenhouse gases from the land, and all the challenges. So basically, land degradation is not one challenge; it's an optimizing different challenges from land degradation. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I think in the earlier presentation, it was mentioned that this involves a lot of cost. It's really expensive, and there is no money, and it really needs a lot of things to make land restoration, attractive. So that's why we are talking about how to make it more attractive. So although land restoration is beneficial and important, it's not really an attractive business for many of the private players, many of the public players, and also many of the institutional investors. And there are different reasons for this. Most important is that the returns it generates are quite low to attract any private investor. The incentive to degrade the land outweighed the incentive to restore, which I think earlier presentation mentioned about the subsidies. We are giving a lot of unsustainable subsidies, which are leading to land degradation. And also, in many of the countries, land degradation is still not a part of their environmental budgets. They are talking about environmental degradation, but there is no specific money as a part of their budgets for restoring lands in their countries. So basically, what you see here is a shortfall of about 300 billion a year for the restoration of lands around the world. So it is quite expensive, and also it's not really attractive for the private players to come in and do the activity. So how do we deal with this problem of not being attractive and then also restore the land? So that's a challenge, right? So we need to talk about this. And next slide, please. In this next slide, I'm going to talk about financial inclusion, which we are working as a part of the project, how to make financial inclusion a very important part of land restoration, so that we can really include people who are on the ground into the whole process of land restoration. So financial inclusion basically means that we have people who doesn't have, for example, doesn't have a bank account. So how do we provide them access to useful and affordable financial products and services? For example, it can be anything like from payments to savings to credits to insurance. So if you look at the left-hand side graph, this is from the recent survey that has been conducted, and it shows that how much number of people are really unbanked around the world. So if I look at the graph here, you can see that most of the countries lies in Africa or South Asia or Southeast Asia, also including China. If I go to the next slide, if I overlay these slides with the potential land that is available for restoration in this country, you can see here, it's nearly like 2145. Let's say in these places where there is a lot of people who are excluded from the financial services sector, there lies the largest potential to restore the land. So basically, I want to say is that financial inclusion is one of the most important components when we are thinking about how to restore the land, and that's where we are talking about it. If I next overlay this graph with another slide, next slide, please. So there are three things now. First of all, a lot of people in these countries where they are not included in the financial services provisions, they have a lot of potential to restore the land. But also at the same time, in the same countries, we have 1.5 billion smallholders who are dependent on forest landscape. And on the top of that, they are not included in the financial sector. That means they're basically excluded from the services you are providing to them. No credit, no access to credit, no access to saving, no access to bank account even. So how do you deal with this challenge when land restoration is a part of the people, a part of the it's a kind of smallholders, farmer who are dependent on that, and how do we deal with this challenge? So we are trying to look into this. Next slide, please. So I think in the earlier presentation we also saw that there is already a lot of activities available, a lot of plans and schemes are available. For example, payment for ecosystem services is already working for some time now. You have also READ to reduce greenhouse gas emission from the forest and also restore the land. But the problem here is scaling and also a major structural gap, as I told earlier, that the funding available and the unbankable small scale producers who are really actually in charge of this ecosystem, those ecosystem we are trying to protect. So I think how we really need to address this gap of financial inclusion and the case of small scale producers who are the stewards of the ecosystem, we really need to think in terms of also social protection, how it can play a big role in making this case for land restoration more attractive to the people who are actually doing the things on the ground. Next slide, please. So in the next part, I will just go through a few examples. We already saw in the earlier presentation that a lot of happening on the top, and we are all aware that it's an expensive thing, and we also need to think about global players, local players, UN system, how they are going to do on the top, but also at the same time, we also need to think what's happening on the ground, and I'll give you some examples which are already there and how we can really learn something from that. The first project here I'm talking is quite old. It's HARITA project, which is called Horn of Africa Risk Transfer Adaptation, where they're trying to really include the farmers in the whole process of land restoration by giving them access to financial services and capacity. And at the same time, the farmers can also pay back the premium by working in the land. For example, working in the watershed management, working for making degraded land better. So in that way, they can pay their premium instead of paying the premium in terms of money. So this is one of the case study that I want to highlight and how to make it more attractive. The next slide, please. And this is also one of the quite famous, and everyone is like for working on this space of how to social protection helps. They all know about this project, which is running since 2005 in Ethiopia, and the program addressed the issue of extreme poverty and reducing the extreme poverty in rural Ethiopia. What this program does is actually, for instance, public works focus on integrated community-based watershed development, covering activities such as soil and water conservation measures, and also other community-based work. But what is most important about is that in the process of providing safety net to the people, it also provides the scope to make land restoration more attractive. As you can see, I just have a graph there where it's described in the red when the project is running in these areas, how the soil carbon stock has or might increase in the future because of this program. So the thing is here is how to link this kind of social safety net program with the benefit of land restoration. So we need to think and scale up this kind of initiative. Next slide, please. Yep. This is also one of the most another interesting case where we are not only talking about making land restoration attractive in the rural areas, but also we are talking about making land restoration attractive in the urban areas. Because as you already might have known that heat wave is a big issue now. We are all talking about European heat wave now. So we should not only talk about making land restoration in the rural areas, but also in the urban areas. And this project exactly what it's doing in combination with other thing. And the project is known as Urban Safety Net for the Poor, which is working also in Sub-Saharan Africa. As you can see from here that the program really enabled the opening of bank account for beneficiaries for the first time through a state-owned bank. And it has saved already more than 11.3 million in terms of beneficiary bank accounts. So this is just to highlight why we should talk about financial inclusion in the whole process of land restoration. Next slide, please. Yep. This is one more example from Sao Tome and Principe, which is kind of small island near Brunei. And they are working on how to make this business more profitable. For example, forest landscape restoration, how to make it more attractive towards investment for the small farmers. And the strategy lies here is that State Bank, like central bank in the country, has launched the strategy for financial inclusion and different kind of microcredit schemes targeted at the agroforestry sector, which support the local entrepreneurs who comes out with new ideas on how to make the products from the forest ecosystem more sustainable, also which gives them the earnings from them, or at the same time, it also makes the land sustainable. Next slide, please. I think in the earlier presentation, it was told that there is something, if I remember correctly, China is one of the main leaders in terms of restoring the lands around the world. And I just want to discuss a little bit on the next step. Yes, financial inclusion is important, but what happens when you really have this innovative financial things around the world? For example, this is the example of Alipay Art Forest project in China, which is going on since few years now. And what you do here is it's a gamified app. For example, you walk in the morning 6 kilometers, you upload the data, You do some green activities, you upload the data. You do any other energy saving scheme, you upload the data. Once you reach a certain level of saving energy, then you plant a tree in the app virtually itself. And once you plant a tree virtually, the philanthropic organization associated with Alipay will plant a real tree in the desert of China for you, if you're really able to save that much amount of CO2. And this process in the last few years have really planted more than 2.23 million trees in China. And the cumulative carbon reduction exceeds 12 million tons. So this is the kind of future we are talking about. So it's not only about the finance we are having, it's also about the innovation that we have in terms of making land restoration attractive. And the point of emphasis here is that we need to bring the people who are on the ground, dependent on these resources, working in the forest, working for the ecosystem. You can exclude them. You can just tell people in the forest of Nepal, just go out, we want to restore the land. No. You have to take them along with you if you want to maintain a balance between nature and people. And here you have to also make a business case. How to make those attractive? You can't really do any land restoration without making the case for making it attractive for the people who are living there, staying there, earning there. And in that whole process, you need to include the people in the financial process. And this is one good example how really you can do in terms of fintech. You plant a virtual tree and a real tree will grow in the forest. So this is the power of financial inclusion and fintech. Next slide, please. But also at the same time, we need to be careful because there are studies which shows that financial inclusion can also lead to both positive and negative ways, because when people grow in the process of economic development, they also tend to have more emissions from their activities, right? So we need to make a balance between these two and try to see how we can make financial inclusion more like incentivizing people not to really produce more CO2, or in the sense that we should make a balance for this transition. And financial inclusion should also be integrated into the climate change adaptation strategies at the local level, national level, and regional level, which specially addresses the side effect of higher CO2 emission associated with improved financial inclusion. This is just a caveat, not to really lose the sight that financial inclusion also leads to higher emission. Next slide, please. I think this is my last slide. So we are still in the beginning of the project, and we are trying to see how we can make the land restoration attractive through financial inclusion and social protection. We are trying to collect as many case studies as possible on the ground and how to really make this thing possible on the ground. And so as I said, I have few of the points that I want to share. Financial inclusion can facilitate restoration successful by providing avenues for integration and including people in the whole process, and can also enable policies and implementation conditions that need to be developed and implemented. And also financial inclusion and social protection are both important, which need to be at some point combined, or to see how it can really make land restoration safe, sustainable, scalable, and also profitable for the people. And there are some questions if you like to discuss, and I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panda, for sharing your expertise with us. As you've pointed out, by leveraging financial inclusion, advocating supportive policies, and prioritizing social protection, I believe we can create a promising path towards land restoration. Now, I would like to move and proceed to the Q&A session. To begin, I would like to first open the floor for our on-site audience. If you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to turn on your microphone and share them. It would be great if you could introduce yourself and kindly specify which speaker you would like to address your questions to. In the meantime, online participants, please type in your questions addressing to the speakers. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Lillian. I'm from the UNFCCC, and my question goes to the second speaker. I'm very much intrigued by the financial inclusion aspects that you mentioned, but especially for Africa, I'm just wondering, how do you bridge the gap between lack of market and then the financial inclusion. So I'm all for the financial inclusion, but then I'm also looking at the market perspective. How are you bridging the gap in your projects on that?
Dr. Panda, please.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting question, and also a complex question which doesn't have one answer, because yes, financial inclusion is important, but as I said, we also need to develop the market for different things that we are talking about. Like, for example, let's say if a community is depending on the forest landscape for their livelihood, how to make those livelihood more commercially viable, at the same time not destroying the forest to the extent that you lose the forest. So the point of financial inclusion here is, I think, more about including those people who are not in the space of finance. Like if they are not in the, let's say, if they don't have a bank account, how do you really provide them insurance benefit, for example, in that case? So the case for financial inclusion more lies in bringing those people into the network of finance first, then we talk about the market. But as I said earlier, there are like 80% of smallholders, farmers around the world, those who are unbankable. So we have to make the first step first, then we talk about the second step of marketing. So I think there need to have synergies between these two. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Panda. Do you have any, please? Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Judith Musa. I'm a student at the UNU AHS. I have two questions for both, like one for each of the speakers. For Dr. Alicia, my question is, where do you think we will draw the line between land restoration and development? Because we are still trying to have better infrastructure, which to many people is a definition of development and progress. But at the same time, we are destroying the same ecosystems that are supporting our lives. So where do we draw the line, and what do you think could be the future repercussions, or which route do you think we can follow? To the second speaker, Dr. Panda, I'm still thinking about Africa. Well, I'm a Pan-Africanist, you'll forgive me. We are talking about the fintech. The people that are seated in those rural areas, most of them don't even have the basic smartphone that is a button one. And yeah, China is giving a good example, but that is China. And to value the plurality of the different ways that we can use to do land restoration, what do you think can be viable for Africa? Not only fintech. Fintech can be one option, but what do you think else? What else do you think can be viable for Africa? Or probably what have the people been doing previously? Because I believe that there has been some quite rich indigenous knowledge per se, and some basic local techniques that the people have used, and they could also be viable. Like what has been there before we now consider fintech, which is a good example really from China. Thank you.
So regarding the first question, Dr. Alicia, could you kindly provide an answer on distinction between the land restoration and development? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting question. I think this hits the point regarding potential synergies and trade-offs of land restoration with broader development goals, particularly in many developing countries, including in Africa. Sometimes a big trade-off comes between in terms of food production. Are we restoring? Are we reforesting? Are we planting trees? How does it affect food production? Of course, we are gaining in terms of carbon. Perhaps we are also gaining in terms of biodiversity, but how it is affecting people. When you talk to different organizations, we will get often the very different responses. If you talk to the Ministry of Agriculture in many countries, they say, oh, we need to feed our people. That's why we have to dry that wetland and expand crop production. But there are, so I think this is one thing that we need to be aware of is explicitly make these trade-offs clear, ideally quantify their costs and benefits, and which this will allow us to make more informed decision. Another element of infrastructure is, of course, expansion of urban areas. So they are expanding all across the continent, and also not only in Africa, but also in Asia, in South America, and other places. So quite often they expand by encroaching on most fertile croplands. So it's important to have these cadastral land use policies to make sure that this urban encroachment is directed to those areas which have lower ecosystem values. And in general, I think what is important, it is clear that land restoration will generate some positive synergies, but also trade-offs. What is important is to have this transparent decision-making system, including participatory approaches where in a decentralized often manner, so that communities who are living, who are in those areas which are subjected to this restoration have a say. So sometimes we overly focus too much on cost and benefit analysis to only take into account monetary dimensions. But then there are, how do you value inequality? How would we value empowering youth and women and so on? So we need to also include multi-criteria decision makings with these participatory approaches to make sure that we are ultimately land restoration activities are enhancing overall social welfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Alisher. And as regarding the next question, Dr. Penda, could you please elaborate on measures to be taken in African region for more feasible fintech local technology?
Yeah, thanks for the interesting question, but I wish I know the answer, in one sentence, this has to be done in Africa. But I will just give one example from the country of Nepal, which is really a very interesting case of forest restoration. In the last in the 1940s, there was a lot of degradation of forest in Nepal. And somewhere in the 1960s, they started thinking about restoring the forest, how to really manage the forest well so that we stop the deforestation. And until now, in the last 60 years, Nepal has one of the most successful cases where forest, stewardship has been really possible, and that has stopped the forest degradation. And the way that it did it is to give the power back to the people, make them the owner of the forest, not the government or the private sector. And that's one approach of looking at, because Africa is really big. I can't really say which region has a good solution and which is not. But as I said earlier, I think the most important point here is to really include people. As you said, many people don't have even a smartphone, but then you also need to include them in the process. For most of the time, as you have seen, this process of land restoration has been driven from the top. Either World Bank comes in, or some other funding agency comes in, or the UN goes there and tell them, okay, this is what you need to do. No, they know the land. They know how it works. They have been doing it since last 2 centuries, 3 centuries. So you don't need to really tell them a lot of things how to do it. You just need to make it possible. You need to facilitate the process so that they can be involved in the whole thing. And at the same time, they don't lose their livelihoods. So I would like to focus again on this balance between nature and people, not only about, restoring the land itself. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to open the floor for our online participants. And for this, I would like to ask my colleague Rika to take over.
Yes, thank you also from my side for the interesting talks. I'm Rika. I'm with the G20 initiative in the capacity enhancement team. And I firstly want to thank the speakers also on behalf of the online audiences. There were many comments with people from all over the world here joining. And we have a lot of questions. I will probably reduce those to one or two. Yeah, sorry. I hope you can hear me again. So the first question goes to Dr. Mirzadbayev. And this was a question which, was repeated in many forms. And I hope you can answer. This touches upon your expertise. It's on how do we incorporate the private sector? How can the private sector help raising funds? But also how do we make them invest in land restoration?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I will try to start answering, and then perhaps other colleagues also could add on that. So big part of the cost of land degradation and benefits from land restoration, as I have shown, are social benefits. So if we leave it alone to the private sector will always underinvest into land restoration because they cannot make full benefit from all, they cannot, what we say, take in, internalize, capture all the benefits. So that's why it's important to have a public sector government playing an important role, I would even say key role in land restoration. But does it mean that private sector cannot be an important player, an important supporter of land restoration? Definitely not. Private sector can play a very supportive role. And in some context, nowadays, we can see many of the economic analysis also shows that land restoration activities start making even economic sense for the private sector. Not only in terms of those ecosystem services that you cannot sell in the markets, but also in terms of those which have a price, which can be sold and bought. And it's playing out increasingly around carbon. Private companies are the biggest investors in the carbon offset programs nowadays. Government can also help by regulation to enlarge that to cover other ecosystem services. For example, by introducing tax reliefs for those companies which are investing in restoring degraded lands. It will help the companies to shorten the time period that takes to recover their investment. So there are a lot of things. So what we need, I think, more is this kind of blended finance, public, private, other, but also this kind of collaboration when government and public sector provides regulations, actively engages with the private sector and works together to involve private sector into land restoration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Maybe also, Dr. Panda, I will pass the question to you if you want to add anything. And then also there was a repeated question on how can local communities, local organizations, how can we improve access to funding for them, especially in more rural areas where financial inclusion might be difficult because there's not even financial institutions there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I would just like to add to the earlier point as he was telling, and I also agree to the fact that private finance is really important. And as you can see that we are running 300 billion a year shortage of land restoration. So it's not going to come from the public sources, all the funding. So, but also at the same time, I just want to add that like what are the incentives for the private sector to come in, as we discussed in the last to presentation, that land restoration is sometimes taking a lot of time. It's not really attractive to the private investors, but then we have to think how to bring them into in the process and make it inclusive. So that's one point. And sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, so I'll ask the second question again. It's about how we have some participants here also from small organizations, and they're wondering how can we improve access to funding, especially in more rural areas where, for example, even financial institutions are not really there. Yeah, so if you could elaborate on this.
Yeah, I think that has been a challenge for quite some time now. And this is not only about land restoration, but it's also applies to the whole climate finance debate, because we are talking about a lot of finance here. And we also know that a lot of financial processes are really complicated for the local players to access the funds that are available. So I would rather say we really need to make the whole process of accessing the finance easy for the people, organizations on the ground, communities on the ground. And how to make that, I don't have a single answer, but we need to take the jump and be more inclusive in terms of making the finance more accessible for the local players. I don't know, maybe we can develop some kind of indicator, some kind of platform where they are more likely to access the funds available. And the second point I would like to add is how to really think in terms of smart financing. Now we are thinking mostly for the land restoration, we are thinking mostly from the point of conventional financing, which really is more about getting the fund from the up and doing the land restoration. But we need to be really a bit smart on this, how to make the financing more let's say, attractive, as I said. For example, how to use insurance instrument on the ground so that we can use that for the people, how to attract, let's say, local investors. Why do you think only about global investors? Why don't you try to leverage the local financing that's available, which really benefit both parties, private people, private companies also, and the local people. So my point here is we need to be really smart, think about smart financing for land restoration, which is also in the very initial stage, because I want to believe that land restoration is not really big agenda in many of the countries at this point. They are still lagging behind. They are still putting land degradation or land regeneration in the basket of environmental budget, not really a separate one. So we need to also make that more explicit to the government and try to find out ways how they can help local organizations in terms of climate financing. I think that should be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. As I can see, everyone's getting hungry. We'll close our Q&A session here. Thank you so much again, audience, for your active participation and patience. I would also like to take a moment to thank everyone who has made this Brown Bag Lunch possible, including not only our audience, but also speakers and our partner UNU EHS and our colleagues for their support and collaboration. Before we close, I would like to highlight that you will be receiving a certificate of participation after the event. And additionally, I encourage you to subscribe to our social media channels to stay informed about our upcoming events, including our next Brown Bag Lunch, which will take place on Friday, September 15th. As you leave, feel free to help yourself to the Brown Bag Lunch available at the table outside as you walk out of this room. And on behalf of G20 Global Land Initiative Coordinator,